The snow came down in sheets that winter, and somewhere in the frozen hills of northern Italy, 15,000 American soldiers were about to run out of food. Not because supply lines had been cut, not because the enemy had surrounded them, but because nobody in the entire United States Army had thought to ask one simple question: what happens when the recipe doesn't work? It was January 1945, and Technical Sergeant James Russo stood in a canvas tent that smelled like diesel fuel and wet canvas, staring at a pot of something that resembled library paste more than it resembled dinner. He had followed every instruction in the manual. He had measured every ingredient precisely. He had done exactly what the army had trained him to do, and the result was completely inedible. Outside, men were already lining up with their mess kits, stamping their feet against the cold, breath coming out in clouds. They had been fighting in the mountains for 6 weeks. They were exhausted. They were hungry. And Russo knew that what he had just cooked would make them angrier than any enemy fire. The official army field ration recipe called for dehydrated vegetables, powdered milk, and canned meat to be combined in specific proportions and cooked for exactly 18 minutes. The manual had been written by nutritionists in Washington who had never seen a battlefield. It had been tested in kitchens with proper stoves and clean water and ingredients that hadn't spent 3 months bouncing around in the back of a supply truck. The recipe assumed conditions that simply did not exist in the real world. Russo had joined the army in 1942, lying about his age because he was 16 and desperate to leave Brooklyn. He had worked in his father's restaurant since he was 8 years old, washing dishes and peeling potatoes and eventually learning to cook. His father had come from Naples and believed that food was the most important thing a man could give to another person. Not the fanciest food, not the most expensive, but food that showed you cared whether someone lived or died. The army had not trained Russo to care. The army had trained him to follow instructions. There was a manual for everything, and the manual was always right, even when it was catastrophically wrong. Russo had learned this during his first week of basic training, when a drill sergeant had screamed in his face for 20 minutes because he had buttoned his uniform incorrectly. The lesson was clear: your judgment means nothing, the rules mean everything, and if you think you know better than the manual, you are dangerous. But now Russo stood in that tent, looking at a pot of gray sludge that no human being would voluntarily eat, and he had to make a choice. He could serve what he had made, and watch 15,000 men force down something that would make them feel sick and betrayed. Or he could throw away everything he had been taught and trust the instincts his father had spent years teaching him. The problem was simple, although nobody in Washington seemed to understand it. The dehydrated vegetables that came in the supply crates had been sitting in warehouses since 1943. They had been frozen and thawed and frozen again during transport. The powdered milk had absorbed moisture and formed lumps that wouldn't dissolve. The canned meat was mostly fat and gristle, because all the good meat was going to officers' mess halls and field hospitals. When you combined these ingredients exactly as the manual instructed, you created something that had the correct nutritional value on paper but was essentially garbage in practice. Russo had watched this happen day after day for weeks. He had seen men take one bite and throw the rest away. He had seen them trade cigarettes for crackers because crackers were at least edible. He had seen morale crumble, not because of the fighting, but because the food was so bad that it felt like punishment. And he had said nothing, because you didn't question the manual. You especially didn't question it if you were a technical sergeant who had lied about your age to enlist, and who came from a neighborhood where half the kids didn't finish high school. Russo knew his place. He knew that officers made decisions and enlisted men followed orders, and that was how armies worked. But something had changed that morning. The battalion had received word that they would be moving up into the mountains for an extended operation. No resupply for at least 2 weeks. They would be carrying everything they needed on their backs, fighting in conditions where the temperature dropped below zero at night, burning thousands of calories every day just to stay warm. The food situation, already bad, was about to become critical. Russo had done the math. If men kept throwing away half their rations because the food was inedible, they would start to weaken. Weakened men made mistakes. Mistakes got people killed. It was that simple. He looked at the pot again. Then he looked at the crates of ingredients stacked against the tent wall. Then he made a decision that would either save 15,000 lives or end his military career. He dumped the entire pot onto the ground outside the tent. The men waiting in line watched this happen with expressions of weary confusion. One of them, A corporal from Texas called out. "Russo, what the hell are you doing?" Russo didn't answer. He went back into the tent and started over, but this time he ignored the manual completely. His father had taught him that cooking was about understanding what you were working with, not about following rules. You tasted everything. You adjusted constantly. You paid attention to texture and smell and color, and you trusted your senses more than you trusted any recipe. The manual said to add the vegetables first and cook them for 6 minutes before adding anything else. Russo looked at the shriveled, discolored vegetables and knew that 6 minutes would turn them into mush. He started with the water, bringing it to a hard boil. Then he added the canned meat, but instead of dumping it in directly, he drained off all the fat and rinsed the meat in cold water to remove the gelatinous coating that made it taste like motor oil. He chopped it into smaller pieces than the manual specified, because smaller pieces would cook faster and develop more flavor. Then he added something that wasn't in the manual at all. There was a crate of bouillon cubes in the corner of the tent, meant for making soup for wounded soldiers in the field hospital. Russo grabbed a handful and tossed them into the pot. The manual would call this theft. Russo called it making the food taste like something other than wet cardboard. The vegetables went in last, and he only cooked them for 3 minutes, just enough to soften them but not enough to destroy what little flavor they had left. The powdered milk he whisked in cold water first, breaking up the lumps, before adding it slowly to the pot while stirring constantly. Within 15 minutes he had created something that actually smelled like food. He served it to the men waiting in line, watching their faces carefully. The corporal from Texas took a bite, chewed slowly, and then looked at Russo with surprise. "This is actually pretty good," he said. "What did you do different?" Russo shrugged. "Nothing. Same recipe as always." But it wasn't the same recipe, and Russo knew that he had just crossed a line. He had violated regulations. He had used supplies that weren't allocated to his unit. He had ignored direct instructions from the manual. If anyone reported this, he could be court-martialed. But the men were eating, and they weren't complaining, and for the first time in weeks Russo felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. That night, after the meal service was over, Russo's commanding officer came to the tent. Lieutenant Morrison was a West Point graduate who believed in doing things by the book. He was not a bad officer, but he was inflexible in the way that people who have never had to improvise tend to be inflexible. He looked at Russo with an expression that was hard to read. "I had 3 different men tell me tonight that the food was the best they'd had since we shipped out," Morrison said. "I want to know what you did." Russo considered lying. But lying to an officer was a worse offense than modifying a recipe, so he told the truth. He explained about the vegetables and the meat and the bouillon cubes and the different cooking times. He expected Morrison to explode, to threaten him with disciplinary action, to remind him that there were rules and regulations for a reason. Instead, Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How much better could you make it if you had access to more ingredients?" Russo blinked. "Sir, we're about to march 15,000 men into mountains where they'll be burning 5,000 calories a day and carrying 80-pound packs. I don't care about the manual. I care about keeping them alive. If you can feed them in a way that actually keeps their strength up, I'll get you whatever you need and I'll deal with anyone who complains. Can you do it?" It was not the response Russo had expected, and it took him a moment to understand what was happening. Morrison wasn't angry about the rule breaking. Morrison was pragmatic enough to realize that the rules were killing morale and potentially endangering the mission. He was giving Russo permission to ignore the manual, as long as it worked. "I can do it," Russo said, "but I'm going to need help." Over the next 3 days, Russo assembled a team of 6 other cooks, all of them men who had worked in restaurants or hotels before the war. He explained what he wanted to do: completely redesign the way field kitchens prepared meals, using the same basic ingredients but treating them like actual food instead of like chemistry experiments. The other cooks understood immediately. They had all been frustrated by the same problems, had all watched men go hungry because the official recipes were so bad, had all wanted to do something different but hadn't dared to break the rules. Now they had permission, and they attacked the problem with an intensity that surprised even Morrison. The first thing they did was inventory everything they had. The supply depot had sent them crates of ingredients based on the standard Army requisition forms, which meant they had enormous quantities of some things and almost none of others. They had hundreds of pounds of dehydrated cabbage, which nobody wanted to eat. They had almost no salt, which was insane given that salt was one of the cheapest and most essential ingredients in cooking. They had canned tomatoes, canned peaches, canned string beans, but no canned tomato sauce or paste, which meant they couldn't make anything with a proper base. Russo sent Morrison a list of what they needed. Morrison looked at the list and whistled. "Russo, this is going to cost a fortune. And half of this stuff isn't even in the standard supply catalog. Then we need to get it from somewhere else," Russo said. "Sir, you asked me if I could keep the men fed. I can. But not with what we have now." Morrison thought about this. Then he did something that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on how you looked at it. He took Russo's list and drove to the nearest town, which was a small Italian village about 15 miles from camp. He found the mayor and explained the situation. The American army was about to launch a major operation in the mountains, and they needed food supplies that weren't available through normal channels. He offered to pay in American dollars, which were worth far more than Italian lira, and he promised that the Americans would protect the village from German reprisals. The mayor was skeptical at first. The Germans had occupied the region for 2 years and had taken everything of value. The villagers were surviving on almost nothing. Why should they sell their food to Americans when they barely had enough for themselves? Morrison understood this objection, and he made a counteroffer. If the villagers would sell them supplies now, the Americans would leave behind medical supplies, blankets, and fuel oil when they moved out. The villagers needed those things far more than they needed money. The mayor agreed. Over the next week, Russo and his team received deliveries of olive oil, garlic, onions, fresh herbs, real salt, dried pasta, and wheels of hard cheese. These were not military rations. These were ingredients that actual human beings used to cook actual food. And with them, Russo began to transform the field kitchen. He started with the most basic dishes. The manual called for meat and vegetable stew, which in practice meant throwing everything into a pot and boiling it until it was gray. Russo made 2 versions of the same stew. The first version followed the manual exactly. The second version used the same basic ingredients but added olive oil, garlic, and herbs, and cooked the components separately before combining them. He served both versions to a group of soldiers and asked them to rate each one. The manual version got an average score of 3 out of 10. Russo's version got an 8. Morrison saw the results and immediately authorized Russo to prepare all meals using the modified recipes. But there was a problem. Russo's team could only cook for about 300 men at a time. The battalion had 15,000. If they were going to feed everyone, they needed to scale up massively, and they needed to do it in a way that could be replicated by other field kitchens. This was harder than it sounded. Cooking for 300 people is very different from cooking for 30, and cooking for 15,000 is different again. The techniques that worked in a small pot didn't necessarily work in a cauldron big enough to bathe in. Ingredients behaved differently at scale. Timing became critical, because if you started cooking too early, the food would be cold by the time everyone was served. But if you started too late, people would riot. Russo spent 2 weeks experimenting, making mistakes, adjusting, trying again. He burned entire batches of food. He underseasoned meals so badly that men complained they tasted like nothing. He overcooked pasta until it turned into paste. Every failure taught him something, and slowly he began to develop a system that actually worked. The key insight was that he needed to stop thinking like a cook and start thinking like a factory manager. He couldn't personally oversee every pot. He needed to create a process that other people could follow, even if they weren't skilled cooks. So he broke down each recipe into steps that could be done in parallel. One team would prepare the meat. Another would handle the vegetables. A third would make the sauce. Everything would be done simultaneously, and then combined at the last minute before serving. He wrote out instructions for each step, not in the formal language of military manuals, but in the simple, direct language his father had used when teaching him to cook. Brown the meat until you can smell it. If you can't smell it, it's not ready. Add salt until it tastes good. If you're not sure, add a little more. The sauce should be thick enough to coat a spoon. If it runs off, keep cooking. These instructions made no sense to anyone who believed in precise measurements and exact timings. But they made perfect sense to the men who actually had to do the cooking, because they described what to pay attention to rather than just what to do. By the time the battalion moved out into the mountains, Russo's system was feeding 15,000 men 3 meals a day, and the food was good enough that morale had visibly improved. Men stopped complaining about being hungry. They stopped trading away their rations. They started to trust that when mealtime came, they would actually get something worth eating. This mattered more than anyone in Washington could have understood. Soldiers in combat are not machines. They are human beings operating under extreme stress, and their effectiveness depends not just on training and equipment, but on whether they feel like the army actually cares about them. Food is one of the most basic ways you communicate that care. When you feed someone well, you tell them that they matter. When you feed them garbage, you tell them that they are disposable. Russo had changed that equation. He had taken the same miserable ingredients that every other field kitchen was using and turned them into meals that made men feel like they were valued. And he had done it by breaking nearly every rule in the book. But the real test came 3 weeks into the mountain operation, when the weather turned brutal and supplies ran low. The army had planned for a 2-week operation. It had turned into 5 weeks because German resistance was stronger than expected and the terrain was worse than the maps had indicated. The supply trucks couldn't get through because the roads were buried under 3 feet of snow. Everything had to be brought in on mules, and mules couldn't carry nearly as much as trucks. Russo's supplies were cut by half, then by 3/4, then to almost nothing. He had enough dehydrated rations to keep feeding people, but those rations were exactly the kind of terrible food he had been trying to get away from. If he went back to serving the standard army meals now, after weeks of better food, the psychological impact would be devastating. Men would see it as a sign that things were falling apart, that the army had given up on them. He needed to find a way to make decent food out of almost nothing, and he had about 6 hours to figure it out before the next meal service. Russo gathered his team and explained the situation. They had dehydrated vegetables, a small amount of canned meat, some flour, some powdered milk, and that was it. No olive oil, no fresh anything. No herbs or spices except for salt and the last few bouillon cubes. One of the cooks, a man named Delaney who had worked in a diner in Philadelphia, said what everyone was thinking. "We can't make anything good with this. We should just tell Morrison the truth and serve standard rations." Russo shook his head. "If we do that, we might as well tell every man in this battalion that we've already lost." "Then what do you want to do?" Delaney asked. Russo thought about his father, who had lived through poverty in Naples and had learned to make meals out of ingredients that most people would throw away. His father had taught him that cooking wasn't about having the best ingredients. It was about respecting what you had and using it as well as you possibly could. "We make soup," Russo said. "Real soup. The kind my grandmother used to make when there was nothing else." The team looked at him skeptically, but they trusted him enough to listen. Russo explained the process. They would take the flour and mix it with water and salt to make a simple dough. They would roll the dough thin and cut it into irregular strips. Those strips would become pasta. Not good pasta, but pasta. Then they would make a broth using the bouillon cubes and whatever vegetables they could rehydrate. The canned meat they would chop fine and brown in its own fat to develop flavor. Everything would go into the broth together, and they would cook it just long enough for the pasta to soften and the flavors to combine. It was peasant food. It was the kind of thing people ate when they had nothing else. But it would be hot, and it would be filling, and if they did it right it might even taste decent. They worked fast, because time was short and there were 15,000 people to feed. The dough came together rough and sticky, not smooth like it should have been, because the flour was old and the water was too cold. They rolled it out on tent canvas because they didn't have proper work surfaces. They cut it with mess kit knives because they didn't have proper tools. Every step was improvised, crude, barely functional. But when the soup came together, it smelled like something Russo's grandmother would have made. It smelled like home. They served it to the first group of soldiers, watching nervously for reactions. The men took their portions and sat down to eat, and for a moment there was silence. Then one of them said, "Jesus Christ, this is good." "What is this?" "Minestra," Russo said. "Italian soup." The word spread. Within an hour, men were lining up asking if there would be seconds. There weren't enough ingredients for seconds, but the fact that people wanted them meant that Russo had succeeded. He had taken the worst possible conditions and created something that made people feel like they were being cared for. Morrison came to the tent that night, and this time he wasn't alone. He had brought a colonel from division headquarters, a man named Patterson who looked like he had never smiled in his life. Patterson stared at Russo with an expression that could have meant anything. "Lieutenant Morrison tells me you've been modifying the standard recipes," Patterson said. Russo's heart sank. This was it. Someone had reported him. He was going to be court-martialed after all. Yes, sir, Russo said, because there was no point in lying. He also tells me that your battalion has the highest morale and the lowest sick call rate of any unit in the division. Patterson continued. I want to know how you're doing it. Russo explained everything. The modified cooking methods, the ingredients from the Italian village, the system for scaling up production, the soup made from flour and water when supplies ran low. He expected Patterson to be angry about the rule breaking, but Patterson just listened with the focus of someone doing a complicated math problem in his head. When Russo finished, Patterson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm making you a warrant officer and putting you in charge of food services for the entire division. You're going to train every field kitchen to cook the way you cook. I don't care if it violates regulations. Regulations are written by people in Washington who have never been cold and hungry and scared. You've figured out something they haven't, and I'm not going to let it go to waste. It was one of those moments where a life changes direction completely and irrevocably. Russo had been a technical sergeant running a single-field kitchen. Now he was going to be responsible for feeding 30,000 men across multiple battalions. It should have been terrifying, but mostly it felt right, like he had finally found the thing he was supposed to be doing. Over the next 6 months, Russo traveled from unit to unit, teaching cooks how to work with the ingredients they actually had instead of the ingredients the manual assumed they had. He showed them how to taste and adjust, how to recognize when something was done by smell and texture instead of by a timer, how to care about the people they were feeding instead of just following orders. Not everyone understood. Some cooks resented being told that the manual was wrong. Some officers complained that Russo was undermining discipline by encouraging people to ignore regulations. But the results were impossible to argue with. Units that adopted Russo's methods had better morale, fewer disciplinary problems, and lower rates of illness. Men fought harder and recovered faster when they were properly fed. By the end of the war, Russo's techniques had spread throughout the European theater. Field kitchens were using modified recipes that bore little resemblance to what was written in the official manuals. But nobody cared because the food was edible and the soldiers were healthier. The army even began to revise its official cooking procedures, incorporating many of the changes Russo had pioneered. But the real impact wasn't in the regulations or the official records. It was in the 15,000 men who had gone into the Italian mountains in the winter of 1945 and come out alive because someone had cared enough to feed them properly. It was in the countless meals served in difficult conditions by cooks who had learned to trust their judgment instead of blindly following rules. It was in the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do in a war is something as simple and human as making sure people don't go hungry. When Russo returned to Brooklyn after the war, he took over his father's restaurant. He never talked much about what he had done in Italy. It didn't seem like the kind of thing worth bragging about. He had just cooked food. He had just tried to take care of people. That was what his father had taught him to do, and that was what he had done. But years later, men would occasionally come into the restaurant and recognize him. They would shake his hand and thank him for the meals he had served them on frozen hillsides, and they would tell him that those meals had mattered more than he could possibly know. In the middle of a war, when everything was terrible and it seemed like nobody cared whether you lived or died, there had been hot food that tasted like someone had actually tried. That small thing had made a difference. Russo would nod and say thank you and offer them a meal on the house, because he understood what they were really talking about. They weren't talking about food. They were talking about dignity. They were talking about the difference between being treated like a machine and being treated like a human being. They were talking about the moment when someone broke the rules because the rules were wrong, and it was more important to do the right thing than to do the approved thing. The story of how one cook fed 15,000 soldiers is not really a story about cooking. It's a story about the choice between obedience and responsibility, between following orders and thinking for yourself, between accepting the way things are and believing they could be better. Russo could have kept making terrible food and nobody would have blamed him. He was following the manual. He was doing what he was told. If soldiers went hungry or morale collapsed, that wasn't his fault. But Russo had been taught by his father that when you feed someone, you're doing more than just giving them calories. You're acknowledging their humanity. You're saying that they deserve to be cared for. And he had decided that 15,000 men trudging through frozen mountains deserved better than what the army was giving them, even if giving them better meant breaking every rule in the book. That decision saved lives, not in any dramatic battlefield moment, but in the slow accumulation of small improvements. Men who stayed healthy because they were eating properly, men who kept fighting because they believed someone cared about them, men who made it through the war because a cook in Brooklyn had learned to trust his father's lessons more than he trusted a manual written by people who had never seen a battlefield. The war ended. The soldiers went home. The manuals were revised. And somewhere in all the official histories and strategic analyses and grand narratives, the story of what James Russo did in a field kitchen in northern Italy was mostly forgotten. But the men who were there remembered. They remembered hot soup on the coldest nights. They remembered meals that actually tasted like food. They remembered the feeling that someone, somewhere in the vast machinery of the army, had cared enough to feed them properly. And they carried that memory with them for the rest of their lives. A reminder that even in the worst circumstances, even when everything seems broken and hopeless, someone might decide that the rules are less important than doing the right thing. That is the real story. Not the recipes or the techniques or the organizational innovations, but the simple human choice to care about people when it would have been easier not to. Russo broke every cooking rule because the rules were designed for a world that didn't exist, and he had the courage to recognize that following bad rules would get people killed. He trusted his own judgment, risked his career, and did what needed to be done. 15,000 soldiers were fed. 15,000 soldiers survived. And all because one cook understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is decide that the manual is wrong, and there has to be a better way, even if you have to invent it yourself.